part of the, Jerry mentioned that innovation is in Carnegie Mellon's DNA. I think people have accused me of having Carnegie Mellon in my DNA because I grew up around campus and I, in some sense, have never lost the spirit that Carnegie Mellon really is. And I think that the wonderful thing about this panel is it really reflects the kind of innovation in brain, mind, and learning and interdisciplinary work that you really see nowhere else in the world except at Carnegie Mellon, which is why I'm at Carnegie Mellon, not because of my father. So I want to introduce the people on the panel. Tom Mitchell, who's a computer scientist by training, but is collaborating with many brain scientists. Nathan Urban, who's a neuroscientist by training, but does much computational work. And Bhaskar, who's a Tarr alumnus, but did work in artificial intelligence and has also studied implications of law and artificial intelligence. And Marlene Behrmann, who is a cognitive neuroscientist, has also done a great deal of work on translational work in how brain injury can impact our lives and how we can deal with those sorts of issues. And the other thing I'd like to say about this panel, and then I just want them to get started, I'll ask the first question, is that these are four of my favorite people in the entire world. Two of them I've known for almost 20 years, Marlene and Bhaskar, and they're both marvelous people to talk to that I've always had wonderful conversations about these issues with. And two of them, Nathan and Tom, I just met the past 2 years, but they've rapidly become, again, two of my favorite people, and I just really cherish the kinds of conversations we continue to have and will have into the future. And it's, again, so uniquely Carnegie Mellon that such a diverse group of people all talk and think about similar problems. Okay, so I want to ask them the first question, and as Marlene said, this is a deep question. It's not necessarily an easy question. I think we're going to start with Bhaskar, and then we'll let it sort of freeform from there, but I will cut people off or point at people and try and get them to move on. So many of you, I assume, have heard about Watson. And Watson has played Jeopardy quite well. Eric Nyberg, who's a faculty member in Language and Technology Institute at Carnegie Mellon, one of the creators of Watson, said, I think it's fair to say that Watson represents a sort of new high watermark in information systems in the sense that it can pinpoint answers for us with speed, accuracy, and confidence in a way that no question answering system could before. So computers keep getting smarter and smarter, and maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a scary thing, I'm not so sure. But the thing that puzzles me as a brain scientist, and I think that we all think about, is how do we know when computers are actually intelligent? And what are the sort of standards by which we say a machine is intelligent like a human being or not? And another way of thinking about it, which I sort of don't have a good answer to, but I keep pondering, is when will it be an ethical question whether or not we're allowed to unplug Watson? Okay? It's not just when he complains. It's got to be deeper than that. Okay. And so that's my first question to the audience. We'll start with Bhaskar and we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Michael. I'm glad to be here. I should explain that I'm the only person here who's not actually a CMU faculty member. I would give a lot to be a CMU faculty member. But I've had to say that since I left CMU in 1978, I've always felt I have it much better. I'm a CMU alum, and very glad of it. I like the question. It's been asked in one form or another for a long time. For 50 years, people have been saying AI isn't possible. They've been saying, you know, this system that you describe is not really doing what you say it is. Or they say, you know, even if it did this, it's not really intelligent. People have deep uncertainties about what constitutes AI, especially people in Boston. There are lots of people. And there are people at MIT who've gotten into fisticuffs with those people and so on. But I want to sort of reach for a CMU answer. So I'm going to sort of start that and then see how far we can go into it. So what is the CMU answer? You know, when I was a graduate student, Herb Simon was the face of CMU for me. He was my thesis advisor, and I would meet him for an hour a week. And we would talk about our research. And then it was time for me to go, and I would be packing up, ready to leave. And then he would hold up some book. You know, it might be a book on nonlinear differential equations or on temporal logic. And once it was a history of the Tang dynasty. And so I figured it out. What I was expected to do was to show interest in the topic, borrow the book, read it, bring it back, and discuss it. So I was supposed to do that. So that's the answer you're going to get. A student in an AI lab who was forced, poor fellow, to discuss the Tang dynasty with an advisor who was a political scientist who invented artificial intelligence. There you have it. So when is it okay or not okay to unplug a computer? You want to, maybe you should incapacitate it, you want to fire it from a job, you want to imprison it, you want to put it to death. Those are the kinds of questions. And these are hard questions, and they're important. They're kind of fun to talk about, but they're not just fun. People have answered them, people have answered them angrily. They've had implications for funding in AI, and they will have implications in the future. So when I think about this, I'm reminded of one of the most awesome exchanges in the history of film that most of you in this room, except perhaps some of you 21st century types, would have come across. I'm thinking about this. David Bowie is stuck in this pod 500 million miles from Earth in a little pod, no radio contact. All his fellow astronauts are probably either dead or dying. And he says, "Open the pod bay doors, Hal." And Hal, in that amazing, scary voice, really flat, unemotional voice, says, "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that." And sometime later, about 20 minutes or half an hour into the film, Dave puts Hal to death. And so the question I have, we answer a question with a question, and I hope to come back to this, but this is the question I'd like you to think about. Would you be willing to be Hal's defense lawyer? Would you be willing to see him acquitted? What kind of a defense would you have for him? And there is a CMU answer. It's not the same as what I would call a local answer, an MIT answer or a Harvard answer. There is a CMU answer that maybe we'll get to, but the thing is, a guy here writing around the corner some time ago said that he wanted a government of laws and not of men. And I'm certain John Adams was thinking of AI systems when he said that. And the point is, how do we make that happen? And all of you CMU graduates are the ones who are going to make it so. Michael?
Terrific. So Marlene can give us a biological perspective on this, perhaps.
Well, I would say that I have a more circumscribed approach to this particular problem because my own area of interest really is human cognition. And so for me, it's a really deep issue about what human intelligence really means and how we're going to define it. Of course, it's a perennial problem that has plagued scientists like myself for a really long time. And I think that there are two aspects that we need to consider in thinking about the sort of the binariness of human intelligence versus artificial intelligence. And the one is that it's not clear that intelligence is monolithic, that there are cognitive issues, there's abstraction and problem solving and planning and projection, but there are other forms of intelligence as well that I think people are becoming to recognize more and more, including things like social intelligence and emotional forms of intelligence. So when we think about the comparison between human intelligence and automated systems or machine learning, algorithmic implementation, I think we need to consider beyond just the cognitive approach and to think to these other facets of intelligence as well. But even if we just restrict it to cognition, which is the domain where AI perhaps is played out the most, it seems to me that the discrepancy between humans and machines is still really vast. I don't think we have to worry yet about Watson taking over our jobs or, Watson really sort of...
He beat the undergraduates.
Yeah, probably time to unplug him.
Okay.
So when I think about what it really means, what cognition really means, much of the AI work, and feel free to jump in, has really been conducted in closed class problems, chess, math, sort of very defined domains, whereas for me at least, and in the research that I do, much of the work is in a much more open, complex environment. So, for example, one of the domains which we cite often about how humans can outstrip even the best computers is in the domain of face recognition. So let me give you an example. Can we look at slide 14? This is one example situation. Here are just a couple of photographs that I borrowed from some colleagues of mine. It turns out, I assume you can all see to some extent, that there are faces in these impoverished and rather sparse images. It turns out machines, even some of the best face recognition algorithms, have a really hard time seeing the faces in these kinds of images. Maybe we could look at the next slide as well, and I'll give you sort of a further example. Humans, at least the human face recognition system, the human perceptual system in vision, and this is in the visual system, the same is true in human speech recognition, is that we can cope with all kinds of variations. I hope you can see in the top row here that it's the same individual whose face seems to change over the course of a lifetime. The same individual looks somewhat different from different poses, in different facial expressions, with different kinds of illumination and blur on the images. The human perceptual system is extraordinarily good and robust at extracting the invariance, at understanding whether this is the same individual or not. The machine learning systems, the algorithms, even some of the best ones that exist in the world, are not yet up to the standard. So I think we're still at a sort of humans, one, machines, half, maybe, in this competition. I mean, they are gaining on us, but I think that the flexibility, the robustness, the immunity to invariance in the human perceptual system is something that will stand us in good stead for a while.
But Marlene, it's interesting because even if you could build a machine that could do this task perfectly, I'd unplug it happily and we wouldn't need a defense lawyer. Yeah, I think
I agree. So I think in the domain of capability, I think it's still humans one, machines a half. I'll give you that. But there's another domain, and from the standpoint of this sort of more ethical dilemma, I think there's a question of almost uniqueness. If we build the same machine 2 times and we give it the same inputs, we're going to have effectively copies, 2 identical machines. And I think there's something interesting about the uniqueness of individual humans that I think bears considering in this kind of context. Another thing that I think is relevant is the fact that, and maybe this is related, if you unplug the machine, you have a much better chance of being able to restore it to that state again. Than we certainly could for a human. And so I think there's and that's important to me. If you're going to unplug me, I want to be able to be restored and to my current state. And I think there's a lot that's going on minute by minute, second by second, that sort of in the background that is an important component of that makes me and my perception of things right now different than it would be for other people, but also for machines. This sort of background processing I think is really important.
Do you agree, Tom? Because I'm not so sure that I agree with you, Nathan.
Well, I think the thing about all computers being the same is kind of interesting. Think about twins with the same genes, for example, or think about a program that starts off, 2 copies of the same program that start off the same way. I think just as twins can develop into different individuals, so could program 2 copies of the same program if they had different experiences along the way. And if, unlike most programs, they were actually learning programs that allowed that experience to change their development and their...
But would that be enough? Because it's actually an interesting question about unplugging and plugging in, because let's say later on they plugged Hal back in and he was perfectly fine and everything was okay. Maybe it's fine to unplug him and plug him back in. And there's something uniquely human where you can't really do that ever. And so there's something that goes deeper about the way human brains work than beyond just the states. I mean,
it's a question of whether that's a function of our lack of understanding, that we couldn't do that, or whether that's something more fundamental.
Well, it seems pretty clear that the difference is really that computer brains are portable. You can stick them on any machine you like, and human brains somehow are intertwined with this biology stuff.
Well, I was thinking, when people criticize AI, the Weizenbaums, the Dreyfuses, the Searles, the Penroses, and so on, I think they make what I would call a mind bug, a conceptual error, a CMU term. And the mind bug is this. They think that the way we evaluate computer rights and computer personhood is by comparing them with humans. You see, I know how I start. I'm a human. I have personhood. I'm sentient. I'm intelligent. And I have an immortal soul, perhaps you think and therefore I have certain rights. And I start from there, then I say, well, look, there are a whole continuum of things, chimpanzees, dolphins, elephants, cats, cows, dogs, worms. They all have, to the extent they are like me, I say they have personhood. And to the extent they are not like me, I say they are not personhood. And so I think that's the basis, a Kantian basis for having computer rights. But actually, computers don't belong in this continuum. They don't belong there at all. I can't ask, is Watson less than a cat? Is a chess machine more than a rat?
So Tom has his own pet computer, which he's very fond of. So maybe you can tell us about Nell, Tom, because here's a case where he's got personhood, I think.
In fact, when Mike asked this question about the ethics of turning off a computer, I was struck by the fact that if he had asked that 2 years ago, my answer would have been to giggle, like, what a silly question. But what struck me about the question is, today I know a computer that I really do not want to turn off, and I would feel bad if I got turned off. I'm not saying that I would be put in jail, I wouldn't, but, and I want to tell you about this program because it's a little bit different kind of program. This is a program we call NEL. NEL stands for Never Ending Language Learner. NEL is now 17 months old. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Its job is to learn to read the web. And every day it has 2 tasks that we evaluate its performance on. One is, every day it must look at the text that's out there on the web and extract more structured information into its knowledge base, its database. And these are facts like, Carnegie Mellon is in Pittsburgh, or water is a beverage, or laughter is an expression of emotion, these kind of facts. So that's one thing it has to do every day, is extract more facts from the web. But more importantly, the second task it has every day is to learn to do task number 1 better. It needs to learn to read better than it could yesterday. How would you test that? Well, you'd send it back to the same text it looked at yesterday, and you'd see whether it extracted more facts more accurately. And if so, then it's done task 2 correctly, which is to learn to read better. So it's been going, here's the slide. Okay. I have no idea when that slide appeared, but somebody was. Okay, so I don't know how well you can see the bottom part of this slide. That's probably the most important part. This is a sample on the bottom part of this slide of 10 randomly chosen, recently read facts. You can see the dates there this week in June, that represent what Nell has recently read on the web. And just in case you can't read those, I can barely. Harry Gamble Pavilion is a tourist attraction. That's the first fact. Another one says Kim Stoltz is a female. Okay, so, and if you look at that set of facts, it's fairly diverse, and that's what Nell is doing. Up in the top, I see, there we are. This plot shows the size of Nell's knowledge as a function of time. I mentioned that Nell is now 17 months old. So that plot starts in January 10, and you see the accumulation of knowledge. You see this dip. That's because the first 6 months the program was running, we just went hands off. We seeded the program by telling it approximately 600 different categories of information we wanted it to read. read about universities, read about beverages, read about people, extract relations like which person plays on which baseball team, things like that. And for each of those, we gave it a dozen or so examples, a dozen universities, a dozen athletes. And since then, it's been learning on its own how to find more athletes, more beverages, more relations of who plays on which team. So this is what it's doing. That dip you see is when we noticed after 6 months that its accuracy was dropping and that it needed, just like most of us, some interaction with somebody smarter. And so what we've been doing every day since is spending 5 minutes a day with Nell, correcting
That's a pretty bad parent. 5 minutes.
It's quality time.
But it's fun, that's right. So I've developed an affinity for Nell. Every day I spend my 5 minutes and I find I get excited when I look at this, I pull up a random sample. You can go to the web and pull up a random sample yourself. You can click on the little thumbs up or thumbs down to help Nell yourself. But I get excited when I pull it up and it's all right. And I get a little, it's okay, but if it makes 2 mistakes. And I find, so for me, the question of, is it okay to turn off this program? I don't know the ethics of it any more than the rest of us do. But I do know this. I would feel bad because I've kind of developed, it's kind of odd to say this in public, but I've developed an affinity for this program, and I want it to get better. I want to go back next week and see that it's not making the same mistake it made today.
Great. Okay, I think we're going to go to another question, which is really the flip side of exactly what I just asked you. And I think I had a new appreciation for human intelligence when I had kids, which is relatively recently. I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. And one of the things that's become clear is that our kids rapidly outperform even the smartest computers around in face recognition and language learning. By age 2, the kids are fluent. Nell's still learning. It's not quite 2 yet, but I don't think it's going to get there as quickly as the kids. So I was hoping maybe, Marlene, you could start and talk about maybe issues of why people are so much better, and maybe with reference to creativity, if you can bring that in, or funny, I should ask that.
No, before I even do that, I think we may in fact be growing some potential individuals who may win both a Nobel Prize and a Tony. So let me show you some examples of some work that is currently being done by students at CMU who are in a whole range of diverse disciplines, but who are engaged both in science and art simultaneously. Can I look at slide 10, please? So this is some work I will show you initially by a photographer in the arts department in the College of Fine Arts at CMU, Patricia Merides. She's involved in the Interactive Brain project. You can see it on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is an example of a photograph that she has done. She's particularly interested in art and biology and art and science. And she teaches a subset of CMU students exactly at the intersection of science and art. If you look at the next slide, you can see an example of some of the really beautiful work that's been done, in this case by a student from the computer science department who is doing some work in arts. And I find this image really stunningly beautiful and really very creative. And perhaps in the next one, you'll see an example of an art student who has taken some MRI images that we have generated and sliced them up, put them on kind of plexiglass discs, as you can see in the bottom, and then put them in a box and illuminated it from the bottom as though this was sort of something of an intelligent sort of sculpture in itself. So I think that there are at CMU initiatives to really bring science and art together. And so maybe one day we'll have Jerry Cowan standing here and saying we've got Nobel winners and Tony winners and some individuals who in fact have been able to garner both. And so the question is, well, what is this creativity? And while we can teach it to our students, why can't computers have it? Could we teach it to computers? So this is a question that I have for Tom maybe. When I watched Watson performing, I actually think Watson's quite creative. and perhaps in an unusual fashion comes up with error responses that really humans would not come up with. But some of them are really quite quirky, quite funny, and quite quaint. Is this computer creativity?
What's creativity? One type of creativity, I think, is really connecting up facts that you didn't think were connected.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly what Watson does, in fact, right?
Yeah.
So it's got this tremendous volume of facts sitting around. You get a question, and those Jeopardy questions demand that you put together weird chains of things. If that's not creativity, I don't know what is.
Well, what about also, though, I mean, Herb Simon used to love to talk about insight. So, I mean, what about the whole, can computers do insight at this point, or is it something uniquely human?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, do you have a thought about that?
Well, I could try.
Do you have an insight on this?
Well, I could try and channel, but I'm thinking that this question has to do with thinking that computers, that when we build computers, we're building approximate people. And then all the questions of rights and personhood and all those things keep cropping up, affect for those people, and so on. But I want to think, let's think about computers somewhat differently, go around it a different way. Rather than saying they're humans, they don't populate this continuum. So why don't we think about something else that's a person that's not on this continuum at all? I know of something, systems that are not sentient, have no physical existence, are not even intelligent, and then they have rights. And they have rights in every society on earth. Even in the most god-awful totalitarian societies, corporations have rights. And corporations are creatures, and they have rights not because they have moral worth or because they are like us. They have rights because they are damned useful. With corporations, we become richer, not just financially, but culturally and intellectually as well. And perhaps that's what we want all these AI systems to do, not to mimic us. I mean, there are plenty of really interesting people around, but to do something on their own, the kinds of things that can protect us from ourselves. I would love to have an automated Supreme Court. I can tell you that. So,
You know, I have
Thanks.
to say, I think that's a really interesting idea, and it makes me realize that if we took a show of hands of who would complain if they turned off Google, I bet we get a lot of hands. So there are programs out there that are so beneficial that just like corporations, we want to give them certain rights to persist.
Right, and it may be that, again, the standards of what we consider creativity or insight and things actually have to be different because there's things that are human and things that aren't human, but as you said, maybe it's already creative in interesting ways. They can certainly synthesize data in ways that we can't necessarily do.
So I'd like to sort of think about this from a somewhat different approach. Again, thinking about capabilities. Why is it that the $2 calculator can solve math problems that I can't? And from my perspective, one of the interesting things, and this gets back to my sort of response to the earlier question, is that there's a biological hardware that underlies it. And that biological hardware works in a very different way than the silicon hardware that underlies, at the root, Nell and Google and all these other things. And I think that by appreciating some of the aspects of this biological hardware, we'll hopefully gain some insight into function, why it is that we can do face recognition, but also into dysfunction, why it is that, under certain circumstances, face recognition breaks down, or why it is, under certain circumstances, we get, hallucinations, or the sort of perceptual disorders associated with, say, autism. And I think that thinking about how the biological hardware implements these things and how it differs from the way silicon hardware does, I think is a very important way to provide insight into these kinds of questions, which are ultimately a lot of the ones that certainly drive funding and drive a lot of the work that we do.
Okay. So I'm happy to say that you've all survived the moderator portion of our show. And we're going to now shift to having questions from the audience. And what I'd ask is that if you have it directed at a particular person, mention that person. If you want the whole panel to try and take it and field it, please just say, panel, answer this question. And so we're very happy to take questions from people about sorts of things.
Yeah, I recently heard that there's a project going on at Carnegie Mellon and a few other. Recently heard of a project going on at Carnegie Mellon and a few other universities to sort of do the Watson project against poker. And it's a bit more of a difficult challenge because of the issue talk about how computers can grapple with really ambiguity of fluff and luck and things like that and mitigate that.
Does anyone want to field that?
Poker.
Yeah,
I mean,
poker.
my understanding, I'm far from an expert but about poker or about this project, but my understanding is that this is already a problem for a lot of online gambling sites, that they do various things to try and determine if the player, quote unquote, on the other end is software. Because there are many ways in which, I mean, people want to think that it's a fair fight. And certainly in terms of being able to remember what cards have already come up, computers can win that. So I think in terms of, in that strict sense, I think computers do very well in poker. I think the advantages that people gain by having, and that's online poker, the advantages that people gain by having sort of access to facial expressions and other behaviors, that's where I think the computers, as far as I know, are still far behind.
Right, but perhaps also, I mean, one of the cognitive abilities that underlie a lot of these abilities, like determining whether somebody is bluffing or whether they're trustworthy, is to sort of the current thought is that you kind of run a little mental simulation of it, because I can't quite know what's in your head. I mean, I can't get into it. I don't have access to your thoughts. But what I can do is I can look at you really carefully, and I can very quickly try and run a little mental simulation. If I were bluffing, I would be doing X, and then I can look at you and say, well, maybe you are bluffing because you've got the same, I don't know, fidgetiness that I would have if I were bluffing. And so this is kind of the idea to do this kind of theory of mind, as it's called, to run these mental simulations. I think maybe uniquely human. I may be wrong.
Well, I think that's one of the challenges, I would say, is
maybe, but we certainly don't have automated systems that are able to incorporate this. And so I think that this is sort of part of the canyon that will have to be crossed in order to be able to get it onto a level playing field, if we want to do that.
Right.
Well, of course, the computer is expressionless.
Yes.
You'll never know if it's bluffing.
Right.
You might be able to judge from the amount of time that it takes to make a decision. I mean, that's the sort of minimal information that I think you could gain. And then, of course, the computer could randomize that if it so chose.
So I would also say, being a regular poker player, often it's not a matter of even the interpretation of reading what they call the signs or the tells. It's more the context and the previous pattern of that person and so on and so on. And so it might be possible to guess.
Well, and that's
if your computer's consistent.
And that's something that computers can certainly do. And the chess-playing computers certainly, looked at every game that their opponents had ever played and knew tendencies based on that.
Actually, in the game of bridge, the evolution of the game of bridge went in the opposite direction, where if you go to the top level of bridge tournaments, you will find that they put barriers so that people cannot see each other. You're not allowed to see your opponent, you're not allowed to see your partner, because the theory is that the game is not fair if you can communicate by things other than speech, and particularly by bits. And so in the game of bridge, the good bridge player is one who cannot use these techniques.
So they're more like computers. They're more like computers.
My relatives.
An example where quote, our evolution of what it means to be intelligent, to be human, is more like a computer. And so I'm not sure that that's necessarily an answer to your problem there, but it seems to me that when a program becomes accepted as intelligent, we do not realize it at all. It will creep upon us, and one day we will find it becomes why we didn't know it was.
I'll wait.
We've got some, okay.
I'd like to bring up a couple of issues that are a little tangential to the primary discussion. Dr. Behrmann brought up, I think, one of the most interesting points, and that is that humans are more than cognition on many dimensions. I think it may have been Howard Gardner who postulated some years ago 7 different kinds of intelligence.
Yeah.
So I think that might be the approach for the question that you initially raised, but I think also it's an issue for the university itself in terms of how it looks for candidates to bring into the university, the students. To what extent does the admissions process fully look at all of the dimensions of intelligence and consider more than cognitive skills, but what kind of people are being brought into the university? So that's one thing that I'd like maybe some thought on. The other is a point that you raised yourself, I think, and that is through evolution, we are wired to have certain advantages, and pattern recognition, I think, is clearly one of the behaviorists have been observing. I'm sure Dr. Behrmann knows a lot about this as well, being a psychology professor, but we see patterns that aren't there. In finance, we see relationships with the financial markets that cause investment strategies that lose a lot of money for us. We have the problem with the deficiency of eyewitness testimony and things that break down there. So I think maybe the test is what are the patterns that we're seeing that aren't really there?
That's it. It's a great observation. I think some of the skills and strengths that we have bring about fallibility in other ways. We are just to return to the issue of face recognition, because that's kind of a no-brainer and kind of easy domain. We are indeed wired to recognize faces with very high probability, even seeing faces in clouds and seeing, I mean, this is this TV advertisement where they show you all these faces, like the keyhole and the steering wheel. I mean, we sort of see faces everywhere, because from a social, evolutionarily sort of relevant perspective, we should be wired that way. That's absolutely crucial for our survival. The problem is that it gets us into trouble sometimes. We tend to see these patterns where they don't even exist. But I think from a survival strategy, it's probably that we make these kinds of false alarms. We sort of over-wired to do this because it will ensure our survival rather than having too many misses. But this, I like the question. I like the oddity associated with it.
Is there a question back there?
My question is centered on it's between the suboptimal acoustics or age-related. I expect quantum intelligence will fix that. My question really is about neuroscience and technology, and the latter, of course, is good as the people who use it. In the magnetic imaging of the brain, they're real time. I'm sorry again if you went over this at some point. That can be used, I suppose, diagnostically for some neuropsychiatric illnesses. Do you see that as a quantum leap, so to speak? Maybe I'm speculating, but looking at, in lieu of a DNA, for instance, it can be a lie detector test, as well as in terms of application to universities. The applicant will present with their MRI image at certain stress points or whatever it is.
Right. So I think I'll answer that. I think I'm going to ask Nathan to answer an aspect of that too. But I want to say that Carnegie Mellon has been a leader and has continued to be a leader in biomedical imaging. It's really one of the exciting areas of strength, and that involves neuroscience imaging and other kinds of imaging of the human body and biological organisms. And it's just beginning. We're in its infancy, and it's already incredible what we can do with MRI, but in the coming years, it is going to revolutionize diagnostic medicine and aspects of neuroscience and treatment of psychiatric diseases, and it's really going to change the way we think about treating and understanding people. At the same time, I want to be a little bit cautionary, because I think that the lie detector question is much more difficult, because it gets back to what Marlene said about theory of mind and understanding a lot more than just what's happening in the pattern of the brain, into understanding sort of the basic principles of our cognitive systems. And I think we're a lot further away than we are from that than having really good detailed pictures of the way our brains work. So that'll be the first part of the problem, is getting good pictures, and then we have to understand what we've got when we've got these huge piles of data. And that's where people like Tom come in and they can help us, and Carnegie Mellon's uniquely set up to do that as well. And I think from a biomedical imaging point of view, I think there's other things that CMU's been doing.
So I didn't quite hear all the questions, so tell me if I missed the target. But I think the ability to see what's going on inside the brain, either in real time, as you mentioned, or even sort of post hoc, gives us tremendous insight. There's a person in my department, in the biology department, who has pursued tools to try and allow this to happen. Her name is Alison Barth. And so what she did is she recognized that it would be really useful to be able to take an animal, in her case a mouse, train it to do something, and then to be able to identify not only which parts of the brain, but which cells in which parts of the brain are the ones that changed or were changed by the process of that learning. So once you identify which cells of the 100 billion cells in my brain, if we could know which ones had changed their properties, changed their function, when I learned something, that would provide us a tremendous insight. So what she did is she developed a novel, genetically modified animal that literally has cells in it that turn green when, after learning, after they are changed in the course of learning. And so this allows us to find the needle in the haystack, to go from a situation where we have initially no idea at a fine scale which cells were modified, and now we know which cells were modified, and we can start to ask the question of how they have changed, how individual cells are changed by experience. That's just one example of the ways in which imaging approaches, which really combine the technology of imaging with, in this case, the molecular techniques that allow us to develop new probes, new genes, and putting those two things together is, I think, absolutely critical for understanding both normal behavior, memory, and also abnormal behavior, disease in the context of the brain.
I just want to add another dimension to this. Also, by bringing in computational methods, including especially machine learning methods, to analyze these kinds of brain image data, what we're able to do is, well, as Nathan mentioned, the wonderful thing about brain imaging is we can see where the activity is, and with some of these other techniques, we can see where the changes are. But it's a lot different to see where the activity is and to see where is the information coded in the brain. And so what we found we can do by using machine learning methods is that we can essentially build virtual sensors of where the information is. And we do it like this. Let's suppose we wanted to know where in the brain is it that you're thinking of a screwdriver when I show you the word. Where is it in the brain that's coding the information about whether you're thinking about the word screwdriver or the word house, for example? So what we can do is we can train our computer programs by showing it, here's an example of a brain image, or even more locally, the brain image for the left half of the brain. When somebody's thinking about screwdriver, here's a different image when they're thinking about house. Here's another one for screwdriver. Here's another one for house. And the program can learn the pattern of neural activity that differentiates those things. And what we found is that by playing on that idea and expanding it, we're now able to train computer program classifiers to detect all sorts of different information, hundreds of types of different information in the brain. Where does your brain, when you think about screwdriver, where is it that your brain thinks about how you would grasp it? Where is it that it thinks about the aspect ratio of the screwdriver? And we're starting to have ways of seeing not just the activity, but which parts of that activity code different features. So it's, when you bring in this kind of computational method, it amplifies the value of these kinds of instruments.
Although I'd say screwdrivers are easy and lying's hard.
Tom, I like the analogy about corporate privileges for computers. And we turn off the computers, like Google, for example, which is, gives you some very beneficial things. But what if, like some corporations, Google violated certain ethical standards? What would you do about that? Sometimes corporations get caught at that and they get penalized. What would you do if a computer complex violated certain ethical standards by, well, as you hear in the news, cracking and snooping and so forth and so on?
So Bhaskar, why don't you take it, and then we can hear from Tom too.
Well, I think what we do is we prosecute corporations. However ineffectively, we prosecute them and we send their officers to jail and expect that to change their behavior. Should we prosecute corporations more vigorously? I certainly think so. But that's a separate issue than whether a corporation should be a person, which is what we are talking about. Should it have the rights so that it's independent of the liabilities of its stockholders and so on? Likewise, should HAL have rights that are independent in some sense of what the programmer does or a particular behavior? Would HAL have been, was it correct, for example, to unplug HAL long enough to get through the air canopy, pull out some modules, and put HAL back in? Maybe that would have worked. And the point is, a good defense lawyer would have gotten HAL off, I think.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
Tom, do
Exactly.
you have something to add? Or?
Well, I would just add that capital punishment for a program is a little bit more acceptable because you can always just turn it back on later.
Well, if Nathan's correct that it's back in the same state, once we get to the point where it's not, then maybe it becomes much more of an ethical question. So we'll get someone from this side.
Dr. Bhaskar, about the kind of corporations and rights, and kind of how the human, I guess, humanistic side.
Can you speak up a little?
Sorry?
Can you speak a little louder?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know if I can get to it right here, but I guess I want to question you kind of thinking about a computer, like rooting a basis of a computer and trying to compare that to a human basis. Because if you think about going back to the child analogy, when a child is born, like when a human is born, we are, I mean, there's so many arguments about cognitive development and how we have this almost infinite potential, but then it does become narrowed down and becomes a finite meta-knowledge. So how do we compare, why should we compare it to a computer when a computer is birthed, it is birthed from naught, when there's no necessarily base knowledge? And I guess how can we kind of compare it to our own meta-knowledge when there is constraint for our knowledge itself?
So you're asking whether or not computers, have the same basis as human beings in terms of if we're going to evaluate whether they're intelligent or not? Or?
There's a good valid point of saying that computers should be its own continuum.
Right, so you should separate them.
Right, but then we're trying to mimic human behavior and human cognition so much that it's kind of like fighting the Greek myth about pushing a rock and then
Yeah, Sisyphus.
Sisyphus.
So,
yes, and it's about, because it is kind of a loop, and like, how do we birth a human from? I don't know. Do you see my point? It's like, it's fighting like that.
Not entirely. I guess I would just say that the only standards we have for evaluating computer intelligence are our own basis, which is human intelligence. And we may have to come up with new ideas about what it means to be intelligent as our computers get smarter. I mean, maybe Nell has already reached some threshold that we don't understand yet, and someday Nell will be in the history books, or Watson will be in there in a way that we go, really, there's something about it. And it's hard to know, except maybe retrospectively, about where we are on that curve. But we tend to just use the human standards because that's what we have.
I mean, because it's a building computer from our own knowledge.
Right, exactly, yeah.
It's own limits, it's within itself, so could we say that it could expand beyond our own?
Right. We want to take the front over here.
Yeah. I was surprised not to hear maybe more about prediction. The old model might be that you need to store a lot of information, so that if you want an AI system, it just has to go into its database, find the answer, and pull it out. But as Jeff Hawkins discusses on intelligence, prediction is really becoming synonymous with intelligence. And I go back to the comment of the hardware of the brain with all its neurons, firing, etc., is quite different from silicon, but is that really a disadvantage? In silicon, all you've got are zeros and ones, but you've got a lot of them, right? And so you can process them like you want. So if you're thinking the way to be intelligent is have a massive database, then you need lots of disk. If you're thinking being intelligent requires a lot of processing, then you need memory or CPU. But if you're thinking intelligence is just a prediction model, then you don't need abundance of either. You just need to be clever. Is that the future?
It's called intelligence.
I just want to say that
That's
I
why
think
it's called intelligence. Yes.
I want to say I think Jeff Hawkins must have hung around at least surreptitiously around CMU before he wrote that book.
So I'll start by saying that I actually think that there are some very interesting ways in which biological hardware conveys advantage. And the analogy here that I like to think about is, if you think about a computer chip, you have, in some cases, 100 billion transistors. And every single one of those transistors is effectively identical to the next. And Intel spends a great deal of time and money developing ways of ensuring this identical this feature of chips, that every transistor is identical. There's a lot of work, including work from my own lab, indicating that individual neurons are in some way, to use an analogy, like snowflakes. Every neuron is a little bit different, even from its neighbor. Even neurons that are allegedly of the same type. If you give them exactly the same input, you don't get the same output. And now the question is that a feature or a bug? Is that something that is to be overcome by collecting activity from lots of neurons and sort of averaging away this variability? Or could you find a way to harness that variability? And some of the work that we've done indicates that at least, we're not sure that the brain itself actually does this, but at least we can find a way to harness the variability that we see from one neuron to the next in a way that allows populations of neurons to represent more information, to perform certain computations more efficiently than if you had this sort of chip-like model of neurons where every neuron was identical to each other. So I think it's a feature. It may have consequences. It may have some negative consequences in terms of my ability to add 6-digit numbers or a string of 10 6-digit numbers rapidly. But I'm willing to pay that price. I'm willing to give up some of those kinds of features for the kinds of capabilities that we have as humans.
And it's leading towards prediction.
And it's leading towards prediction and a better representation of the stimulus, and therefore allow us to predict what that stimulus is how that stimulus is going to behave in the near future.
I'm sorry that actually that was going to be the last question, but I will invite everyone to go into the reception area and talk more to the panelists. Second of all, I want to invite everyone to come visit Carnegie Mellon. As Jerry mentioned, it's changed a lot probably since you were there. There's a lot of amazing things that we could all show you and would love to show you. And Pittsburgh's also changed, and there's lots of amazing new things to do there as well. And finally, I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and we're very flattered that we had such a great turnout. So have a great night.